Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Digital Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Jordan Soloff, news reporter at Digital Health. And so we're going to be delving into a few different topics and issues such as NHS open source policy, data centres, large language models, FDP, and the significant changes at the top of NHS England when it comes to tech leadership. Really happy to have Marcus Bohr here with me to get stuck into all of that. Marcus, just for
Hi.
those kind of watching and hi Marcus, just for those watching and listening, do you want to kind of introduce yourself, let people know a bit about kind of your background, what you've done in the past, what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. I'm Marcus Bohr. I'm a GP. I live in York. Um, I've got a career in health technology, digital health that started probably in the early 2010s. So I'm not the newest newcomer, but I'm not as long-standing an expert as some people in the field. I Before that I was a hospital doctor, so I qualified in 2000. I did about 10 years of ICU, A&E, and um, anesthesia, and then I decided to move into general practice, and that's where I started to get involved in computers. And it just really fascinated me that there was this area where I think the information was not flowing very well. We had quite poor quality systems, even though general practice is renowned for having these computer systems that do everything you need. There was a lot that they didn't do. They didn't really sort of fly. They were quite boring in a way. And I thought, so that got me interested in it. And that took me down a line of becoming involved in the political side. So, I mean, I was the chair of the RCGP Health Informatics Group for about 3 years, did my time as that and handed it over. And I run a lot of forums around digital health. So I run the Digital Health Networks, which is, of course, the kind of forum of record for this community, this digital health networks. I run a bunch of other forums. Some of them are pro bono, sort of open ones like Open Health Hub, and then others are similar sort of CCIO type forums that I run around the world for different communities that are like this one. And in terms of the projects I've been involved in, I've been involved in all kinds of slightly random projects, usually things that I think should exist. So you probably weren't involved in the community back in 2017 when we did NHS Ubuntu. That
Mm.
was our attempt at making a Linux operating system that was tuned for the NHS. uh, there's whole stories behind each one of these things, and so probably too much to go into today. But we can I can give you links to get more of the story on those kind of things.
Hmm.
I was involved in a project to build an open source GP clinical system back in 2012 with the late great Ewan Davis and Rob Dyke. And more recently, I'm building an open clinical terminology. So a replacement for SNOMED CT that doesn't have the restrictive licensing terms around it. And I've got a sort of super secret project on the go at the moment, which I will be talking about, but not just yet, because I want it to be kind of like ready to show. But essentially, it's an electronic healthcare record standard. But again, everything is open source. I only ever do open source projects.
Great. Let's get into it, and then we're going to continue the open source theme, get straight into that because this is a story that you kindly brought to our attention, actually, at Digital Health News, that NHS England had kind of quite quietly removed the pages on open source policy from its website. So that was something that we wanted to pick up. So we had a look into that and contacted NHS England, and they kind of told us that they were removed as part of a regular cleanup exercise for the NHS website because the policies ceased to exist when NHSX was merged into NHS Digital and NHS England in 2021. They said that NHS England now follows the government service standards for building services, which describe the NHS's open source policy. I want to ask you, Marcus, what you kind of think of that response and where you think we're at the moment in terms of NHS open source.
Okay, well, so the response is a placeholder response. It's your standard NHS England sort of nothing to see here. Deny it that there's a problem, that the problem is you, is the kind of response that you tend to get out of them. Um, If it was a part of a routine clear up, then generally what you would do is a page, you wouldn't allow a page to just become a 404 not found. You would redirect that page to where the content now is. So, for example, if they say that they are now deferring to overarching government-wide open source policies, then link to them. You'd leave the page there and say NHS open source policies are no longer needed because we defer to a more one further up the chain, as it were. We defer to the government-wide policy, and here's a link to the government-wide policy. They didn't do that, so it just to me it says they are trying to retrospectively justify the fact that they lost a load of pages. I mean, at the moment, what they're doing is, they're dealing with the merger in terms of websites and things of NHS Digital into NHS England. So a lot of stuff disappeared just because of that. Kind of everything got moved and not everything has been redirected.
Yeah.
But the bigger picture is, are they doing anything that is on the government's gov.uk open source guidance? And the service standard for gov.uk, as well as the NHS own service standard, which is still available, they both say that all new code should be open source because it's publicly funded, it's made with public money, and therefore it should be public code. And they aren't doing that. So whatever our arguments and disagreements about the websitey stuff, the fact that they're asserting that they have taken any of it down in order to better adhere to the gov.uk guidance is just palpably rubbish, because the state of open source in the NHS is really, really poor. It's much further behind than it was in, say, 2015. So in 2015, there was an actual NHS open source program, and there were named people who had a job to identify and promote open source work across the NHS. That's all been destroyed. We had sadly, a kind of theft of open source. All the momentum around open source was stolen by the Aperta Foundation, that was essentially came from the NHS open source program. It grant funded itself, I think, £500,000 and founded a separate Aperta Foundation, which was proceeded to be run completely into the ground by the people who ran it. And really, that money didn't go anywhere, even though £500,000 quite a good amount of money to develop software with. You can do useful things with that. But if you just run a foundation, you can easily vaporize money without producing any software,
Mm.
because running a foundation itself has an overhead, and you just burn the money, keeping the lights on without actually making any outputs. And I think that's the really big shame, is this NHS open source is a really fertile potential ground. We already have a political structure of the NHS which understands sharing. The whole NHS is about sharing the risk of illness. We essentially are taxed at source, and that money goes into the NHS so that we can all pay for each other's illnesses. That's the purpose of it. It's a risk sharing situation. And clinicians fundamentally understand the ethos of sharing medical knowledge. So if I have a medical innovation, I have a responsibility to share that. So they really get it when you talk about sharing code. They kind of go, yeah, we should be doing that. If you've got a piece of code that does a particular thing for the NHS, whether it's a risk score or a clinical calculator or an API, they fundamentally understand that it's a good idea to share that as widely as possible.
Yeah.
So the NHS could be a fertile ground for this, but the leaders we've got, they don't understand open source enough to be able to promote it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the fact that it's kind of was hidden is a sign of kind of what's happening at the top, which we'll get onto in terms of those leadership changes as well. But to
Yeah.
move on, as well as kind of open source, obviously, do you think in terms of in-housing and sourcing software development, is NHS England doing that as enough, or what would you like to see in that on that sense?
No, it's not doing enough of that. And yes, I think it's an incredibly good way to get value for money. It it's win, 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 win when you do this. Okay, so if you start creating developer posts in the NHS, you're building capability, you're investing in people, you're in-housing those skills and making them essentially something that we can all access within NHS England's sort of structure. Um, you're building a kind of um, a capability within NHS England. Contrast that with the alternative, which is always buy other people's software or get your capability from an outsourced company. And in all those situations, the external companies are the ones that benefit. So if NHS England decide they want to, I don't know, commission an NHS app, and they do that via companies like Kainos and IBM, who are the current contractors, the developers that work for Kainos and IBM work for Kainos and IBM. Their primary allegiance by contract is to those companies. They will do what their line manager tells them to do for the benefit of those companies. Whereas if we had our own in-house teams, those developers would be contractually working for NHS, for the NHS, for NHS England or whatever company, organizational structure we use. And fundamentally, their allegiance is to the NHS. And the costs of this sort of thing, that's another way you can win, is that there's no way to outsource something without it costing more. Just
Yeah,
mathematically, if if it costs X amount to do a thing, then a private company is going to cost you X plus profit. Otherwise, they're going to go out of business. I run a company of my own, and so I'm not anti-commercial, but I just understand the fact that every outsourcing contract includes a margin, and that's the profit margin. So we're always paying over the odds when we're outsourcing, when we're procuring um, from other companies, whether it's an off-the-shelf platform, whether it's something they're building for us. And I think the other reason why we would win from this is that fitting into the previous topic about open source, it gets to be a very difficult conversation to say we want to procure a piece of software from an external company, but say, for example, we decide we want them to open source it, then they could well say, well, we don't want to open source it. And we end up then in a bun fight with a commercial outsourcer where they kind of don't want to open source it because they're worried about code quality, they're worried about maintenance of the code. They can always come up with reasons why it's a problem to open source it. Whereas if we in-housed all that development, we just say, look, we as the NHS, we've got a service standard, we've got a gov.uk service standard, we're building it, get in the right talent that understand open source, and actually that drives the costs down. It makes it cheaper to build. Whereas when you're outsourcing something like this, because they may not want to open source it, primarily because they want to lock you into a product that's closed source. They can't do it if it's open source. So they will invent barriers and impediments as to why they can't open source it. Or at least if they do open source it, they'll charge you more. They'll say, well, there's an awful lot of additional community work, and we've got to have a website and documentation and GitHub, and that means it's going to cost more. And so a cost-conscious procurer will say, okay, well, we'll have it, but we won't have the open source option, as
mm,
though that is something that costs more and is more difficult to do. People who understand open source realize that it costs less and it's easier to do.
yeah. I was just thinking as well, if NHS just outsourced a little bit less the money it'd save that could then be used elsewhere, I think is another factor
Yeah,
that,
there's over the years there've been a couple of campaigns. A really good campaign by Ripple OSI from back in probably about 2017, backed at the time by the Aperta Foundation, was to get 1%. So we called it the 1% campaign, and the guy who spearheaded this guy called Tony Shannon, who was actually somebody who really influenced me strongly in the open source movement. He now works for the Irish government as their not in a health related role, but actually as a kind of chief information officer, and is a real open open source enthusiast and driving open source in the Irish government. Um, and that 1% campaign was asking for an insurance policy, which is okay, you've decided you're going to spend tens of millions of pounds, if not more, on closed source proprietary products. And you have, as an NHS, we have a belief that those things will give us the things we want. So do that. We said, go ahead, but please give 1% of that money. Let's like cream off a little 1% of that money and put it into an open source fund. And at the same time as we're buying these procured platforms, we will use that 1% to build open source equivalents. And
Yeah.
we've never been able to get anyone to bite on that. But to me, it's a very low, it's an easy win in that for that 1%, you could absolutely definitely, I guarantee, produce brilliant software.
Yeah.
And we would have that forever. So gradually, the 99% would actually shrink because you would find that we no longer need to buy certain products because we have an open source equivalent. So for the NHS, low hanging fruit would be things like a patient administration system. Across the NHS, every trust has a PAS, and it's not doing masses of very clever stuff. It's not, it doesn't require entire data centers full of GPUs to train a PAS. It's a really simple deterministic database. If we built an open source PAS, we could offer that and say, well, when your PAS comes up for reprocurement, have a look at this open source PAS because that basically is free. You can just start using it. And gradually you would find one trust would use it, two trusts, 10 trusts, and then it would become a standard. And when you've got to that point where most of the NHS is using the open source PAS, the open source PAS will definitely have more features. It will have, because we'll be adding to it all the time. And all those trusts can add to it. And suddenly we start get to this snowball effect where no closed source competitor can actually keep up with the feature set of the open source one.
Yeah.
And that's when you win, you know?
Hmm. It almost makes too much sense, Marcus, for the NHS, that one.
It
But we'll see.
almost as if I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I wanted to move on to chat about kind of data centers. I think it's something that we probably haven't written too much about in Digital Health News, which is probably one of the issues. In terms of kind of data centers, NHS-owned data centers, is there an opportunity that's not currently being grasped with these centers?
Yeah, absolutely there is. I mean, data centers are a fact of life. We need places to run cloud computing, and they are just a room full of servers. They have specific needs. They've got security needs, they've got energy needs, they've got cooling needs. And um, we spend a lot of money collectively across the NHS using the cloud, and we might be using Azure, we might be using Amazon, and that's fine. That definitely has resulted in an iterative improvement in the agility of the software that we can deploy across the NHS. But there's absolutely a way that the NHS could be building its own data centers. And we already own very large buildings across the country. So we could actually put a data center in every hospital. The hospitals already have good power supplies. Yes, they might need to be upgraded if we're going to put in massive data centers, but I think we should be beefing up the data centers in our hospitals because firstly, they're on site where the care is happening. So they're less susceptible to like a internet outage. We can use the waste heat to to heat the hospital in winter at least. And yes, of course, in summer we've got the same problem that every other data center has, which is how do you cool something that's, when it's hot outside. And I know
Yeah.
there've been data center meltdowns across the NHS already. So I know that I'm in an area where people are going to be like face planting or face palming. But surely we could use the waste heat from data centers in the NHS to heat the hospitals. So that's like we're using that energy twice.
Yeah.
Um, and it would also reduce our complete reliance on the private cloud or the public cloud, as they call it, as in private companies that sell cloud services. And what we would do is essentially aggregate all those data centers and have like NHS wide web services. So it needs to have the same sort of interface that, say, Amazon or Azure has. So we need an NHS wide cloud. And then when you sign up for an account there, just like you do with Amazon Web Services, you can purchase services direct from the NHS. But of course, we'd be able to offer them to NHS clients essentially at cost. So that drives down the cost for the NHS.
Mm.
Um, and it means your existing programs would still be able to interact using those same APIs that they use for Amazon. We just copy those API structures. So it's like you can just move your app from Amazon to an NHS data center, and you'd be able to pick where you want it to be based. So which hospital site or which non-hospital site across the NHS would you like your data to reside in? So you could have that locally, you could have that remotely. There is absolutely no reason why we wouldn't do this. I mean, the story of Amazon Web Services is that they needed web services and they set up cloud computing to fulfill their own needs. And then somebody piped up and said, I think there's a market for this outside of Amazon. And suddenly you've got Amazon Web Services. So they've already done the pioneering there. This is now a commodity thing. It just makes sense for us to do this now as an NHS. The fact that we're not doing that is just a failure of our digital leadership.
Yeah, I think I really like the idea of kind of using the waste heat to heat the hospitals again.
It's
It's a good
another
idea.
win-win-win-win-win all down the
Yeah,
line. And it reduces our reliance. It doesn't mean we don't use any Amazon or any Azure. It just means you can gradually transition off it.
yeah,
And we could even, I mean, one of the things that medical data has that's special is that there are some more rigorous security rules around it. And there are certain due diligence and compliance checks that have to be made on the wherever you process your data. And if we have NHS data centers, then we can pre-approve them. We can say, if you're building an app and you're going to build it in an NHS data center, you've already passed your DTAC for that, or any of the cloud computing requirements that have to be checked for compliance with information governance rules, security rules. You can already check those off because you can say you're using an NHS data center. So that just saves you a huge amount of compliance time, quicker to market, cheaper to market.
yeah, absolutely. Another story we did recently was around OpenAI launching ChatGPT Health in the US, and we've seen other tech giants like Google and Amazon launching large language models in healthcare. I want to ask you what you think kind of the implications of this are for the NHS.
Um, I'm, I, I don't think it's that exciting actually. Over the years, we've seen everything from Microsoft Health Vault, Google Health, Apple Health Kit. Everybody's had a go. They all try it and they walk away after a few years and abandon the project. So, firstly, I I wouldn't on principle use something like OpenAI Health or ChatGPT Health because I would be concerned that they'll walk away from the market in a couple of years' time. So if you put a lot of effort into using it and then they decide like Microsoft Health Vault to just shut down the project completely and delete the repositories because you know if I wouldn't build a company around it, and I also wouldn't put any of my personal data in it because it's going to end up homeless in a few years' time. Um, what it does do, it points to the fact that there's a market there. There is a need for people to understand their own health data and probably to use large language models to make it more understandable. I think that's a great thing. Um, People already do that with ChatGPT. And there are anecdotal reports in the press of people who've made diagnoses of their child has got these symptoms. They put it all into ChatGPT and it pops up with, oh, it turns out your child's got a rare syndrome that the pediatricians didn't think of. And actually, large language models are likely to be extremely good at that kind of rare pattern recognition, where you've got all the symptoms, but no one's thinking of it because it's so rare. But if but models will be good at some of that kind of thing. Where would I like this to go? Okay, I think if we had reliable persistence of our medical data somewhere that's controlled by the patient, so that means a single patient record essentially. Perhaps it'll turn out to be what Wes Streeting wants the single patient record to be, although we've heard this before.
Yeah.
Every couple of years, somebody comes out with this idea, and no one actually manages to do it because they make it into a massive government silo of data. So it can't just be a bigger silo. It needs to genuinely be patient centric. But if you could get all the patient's data together, so that means not just bits of it, but all of it, every single scrap of data about a single patient, everywhere that it exists on the NHS, every trust, every GP, every external service like physiotherapy or ENT or whatever, all of that stuff, all in one place, then it would be great to be able to say, here's an option to use your own, bring your own LLM if you want to, give it access to your data and put that in the patient's control. We shouldn't be doing this for them. We should be making it really easy to do, but it's got to be an opt-in so that the patient is in control of which model they put in front of which parts of their data, and then they can ask it the questions that they need to ask it.
Yeah.
And we should also remember that for the vast majority of people, they just don't need it. I mean, the vast majority of people's health needs are quite straightforward. The ones who've got complex health needs are often too ill to need to engage with ChatGPT Health. And so there's a kind of sweet spot in the middle, which is people who've got just about complex enough health needs to want to involve an LLM in it, and also the time and the capacity to start playing with this. And there are lots of people who just don't want to have to do this. In a way, we want patients to have some control, but a lot of patients don't want all the control. They want to outsource their healthcare. Essentially, they want to pass it over to their GP or their secondary care provider, and that's legitimate. We shouldn't be forcing it on people who don't want to do that.
Yeah. Certainly be interesting over the next few years, kind of where
Mm.
this goes and who kind of stays in the market and who drops out. So we'll have to see there.
Well, and I think one thing I didn't mention is that there is the opportunity for the NHS to develop its own models here. So a model is just software. There are open source models already out there that are general purpose language models. But if we optimize them to be able to understand the NHS better and navigate the NHS better, and also optimize them with medical knowledge, optimize them against dummy data from across the NHS, we could actually get something that delivers better results. And of course, if it's not a commercial service, we can evaluate it in a much more unpartisan way. So ChatGPT Health, for example, is a commercial product. If we were to evaluate it and find that it's got some serious safety problems with it, it's likely that we would get sued by ChatGPT, who are worried about their share price falling as a result of the NHS saying that they won't use ChatGPT Health because it potentially has a failure mode or some kind of clinical safety issue. Whereas if we were developing our own models, they're not commercial products. They can be properly evaluated, both good and bad. So when they get to the point that they're really good and they actually provide benefit, we can say that, but we can also point to the clinical safety issues with them without fear of getting sued by a massive company.
Yeah.
And so it allows us to do that scientific evaluation of, are these things actually good?
Yeah, definitely. There's an opportunity there for sure. We mentioned it at the start of the last few months. We've seen some significant departures, some big names in tech NHS England that are now gone or going. Vinda Varka, who's National Clinical Transformation Director, Sonia Patel, Chief Technology Officer, on the move, Ming Tang, Interim Chief Data and Analytics Officer. So yeah, it's a big change happening. What do you think this tells us about the direction of tech leadership in the NHS? And in terms of who comes in, who's going to lead the way, what do you want to see? Do we need a completely different direction of travel here?
Um, we do need a completely different direction. I think the slew of departures tells us that something's going on behind the scenes that we don't yet know about. But internally, they probably all aware that something's going to happen. It might just be that it's that they don't fancy the merger. You know, they're going to be merged into the Department of Health and Social Care, and they don't want to be part of it then. Um, Although, why wouldn't they wait for the voluntary redundancy round?
Yeah,
I don't know, but so I suspect there's an element of uh, leaving. What's what's the phrase? Oh, not rats leaving a sinking ship. That would be cruel. But leaving early to avoid the rush, perhaps, is a little bit kinder.
yeah,
But it's so I think there's probably an element of that. But look, I I'm long past the stage of looking to that leadership now for my new ideas because they are not producing those new ideas. The people who have been in those posts going back decades have generally been more politician than technologist. And even when there are clinicians involved, I think sometimes they don't necessarily bring the clinician voice. So they're not bringing the grassroots clinician's voice to the center and saying, we need these things. It's kind of the opposite. It's bringing the center's voice outwards. So there does need to be some kind of rethink, but I'm sort of past hoping. I've got to the point where I don't imagine that the next people they hire to those posts will make a big difference. In fact, I look at those posts in the same way as I look at the singles chart. You know, like it's become completely irrelevant who is at number one on the Spotify singles chart, just as it's become to me completely irrelevant who is the NHS CIO, CDIO, CCDIOX. It it doesn't. It's never made a difference to me because they never seem to do anything apart from procure stuff from bigger and bigger companies that shaft patient privacy, um, that defund the rest of the NHS in terms of its ability to build tech. So unless we get somebody in post who's going to do a radical round of insourcing, do all the things we just talked about, you know,
yeah.
open source, in-house teams, build those data centers, that would be an interesting guy to listen to or girl, you know. Let's let's see whether we get that person.
Yeah,
I don't
let's
know.
see. Ming Tang, obviously, as I said, one of the people leaving, and she was obviously kind of responsible for the FDP, quite a big kind of almost the face of the FDP in terms of when she used to come to Rewired and speak at the various events. Lots of mixed
Hmm.
opinion, fair to say, on the FDP. We have heard from some trusts about how it is benefiting them. We've also heard plenty that are less in favour, should we say. I want to get your
Yeah.
opinion on where you think the FDP programme is at the moment and how also might the leadership change impact it.
So it, the FDP is starting to get some adoption. I don't think it's delivering the really transformative changes that were promised because I think in the minds of the people who were peddling this idea, it was that we'd have almost like a minority report, kind of sliding screens and information dashboards about every single aspect of the NHS and how well it was functioning, and we'd be able to incisively make decisions about what should happen and when it should happen and things. And that is a fantasy. Let's face it. The actual use cases will be much more pedestrian and they're much more kind of localized and pretty much what trusts were already doing. And a lot of them already had some kind of an analytics and planning platform, but they are now being forced to use the FTP because it's kind of already been paid for. And Um, so where is it? I don't actually know. I think it's under delivering. It's going to cost a lot of money. It would be something that a new broom, so a new incumbent might look at and say, is this really delivering what it should deliver? And is it worth the money that we're spending on it? I think Palantir as a supplier have in the last year or so really come out of the shadows as a bad actor. Um, if you look at what they're doing, supporting ICE and supporting the genocide in Palestine, um, whereas in 2021, when we first started campaigning against Palantir being used as the contractor, in 2021, it's probably easier to say, look, there's a bit of equipoise. We don't really know that they're bad people. This is their healthcare arm. That's their military industrial complex arm. You know, now it's much more obvious. And so I think someone coming into the situation now might say, hang on, are we sure they're the right people?
Yeah.
So there's potential for a review there. Whether that will happen, I don't know, because one of the things that's been obvious throughout the FDP program is that people like Ming Tang were never in charge of it. It's come from above Ming Tang's pay grade. This came from government. It came from essentially the Tory government that preceded the current one. So a lot of the people within NHS England may have actually just been railroaded into doing this without any control. And so that's one of the reasons why, I'm not keen to criticise individuals in NHS England for their role in it, because I'm not sure they had a choice.
Yeah. Interesting, certainly for the people that come in. Is, as you said, it's something to review. I think looking forward, I think there's some big decisions to make around that, and
Yeah,
we will see.
absolutely.
Finally, then, as we look ahead to the rest of 2026 and beyond, a little bit more general question. And the world of digital health, what's kind of one thing that really excites you moving forward, and then also one thing that concerns you?
Okay. Well, absolutely 1000%. The most exciting thing right at the moment is agentic coding, and the fact that you can now put an LLM in a loop and have it act as an agent. And whereas even 6 months ago they were writing clunky, buggy code, now they are able to write entire code bases in a few hours. And so the bottleneck has moved. What we used to do was spend a lot of time and energy planning and making sure we didn't do the wrong thing, and we would write a huge waterfall specification for what we should build, because we knew that the development process and the building the software took ages and costs millions. And now I think what the take home is from this is that the actual coding process is now much quicker and much cheaper. However, you still need to know what you're doing. You still need to understand the domain. You still need computer science and developer people to understand the architecture of what they're building. But the daily grind of writing code by hand, one character at a time, that's gone away for anyone who's interested in, efficiency. So hugely exciting. It means that you can write a specification in natural language in a GitHub repository as a plain text file. So you don't need to be a developer to do that. You can write what you want. I want an app that does this, it does this, it does this, it does this. When you click here, it should do that. Write all that down and then put the LLM in front of it and say, build that. Go and make a cup of tea. And when you come back, it will have started.
Yeah.
And I've been doing this for the last few months on several of my personal projects, and also on work that I do for the RCPCH. And it's absolutely transformative. So what does the NHS take away from that? One, if you are being charged an awful lot of money to have software development done by an external agency, you need to demand a recount, because the costs now are dropping radically. It's a great inflection point for the NHS to do some massive insourcing, right?
Hmm.
If we in-housed all our developers and put them in front of good quality AI agents, we've got that. We can build an awful lot of software in a very short space of time, because we fundamentally understand the use case, the domain, all that kind of stuff. It's power tools in short, because if you think, um, I always use the example of a kitchen fitter. Okay, kitchen fitter that doesn't use power tools these days would be out of business. So you're using power tools to cut the worktops and to fit everything, but you still need to understand how to build a kitchen, right? The power tools are not doing it for you. So there's still a market for people who have that skill, but they're all using power tools to do it faster. No one is using a hand drill or a hand saw or a plane, you know?
Yeah,
Everything is done with machinery. And I think it's the same thing that's happening to coding. Now we've got the power tools. You still need to know how to build a kitchen, metaphorically. So
yeah,
I'm very excited about that. And what am I concerned about? Uh, I would say some of the things we've talked about already. I'm concerned about the drift away from open source. I'm concerned about the relentless outsourcing and procuring that's going on. So we're buying our software from people instead of building our own. There's a couple of other concerns that I have. Data quality across the NHS is something that we never talk about. People talk about data a lot and how much the NHS data is worth, but one of the things that's fallen off the agenda is data quality. And so to cut to the chase, you only get good quality data when you're paying people to make the data high quality, just to save the kind of working there. So a good example is there is high quality data in general practice along all of the QoF criteria, because they have to keep that data high quality, tight and accurate, because it's how they get paid. So essentially they're being paid to keep high quality data. Anywhere that's not a QoF criterion, you will find that the data quality is much more variable in general practice. In hospitals, data quality is absent. I mean, we don't code in hospitals. So I think it would be really good to make 2026, 27 a time when we start to consider data quality across the NHS, advancing the cause of SNOMED. So I did mention that I have a slight problem with SNOMED's licensing, but at the moment it's the only game in town. So if we're going to use a clinical coding system, we should be using it everywhere. We should be able to do that in secondary care, tertiary care, community, not just in general practice. So data quality, it's the elephant in the room about data across the NHS.
absolutely. Yeah. Well, sadly, we've flown to the end of the episode, but really interesting
Yeah, it's gone
discussion there
fast,
on
isn't
that.
it?
It has, hasn't it? Yeah, interesting range of important topics we've chatted about there. It's going to be intriguing how things play out. I think in terms of all sorts of things, data centers, tech leadership at the top, certainly interesting. And I'm sure many of these discussions will continue as well. Digital Health Rewired. We must also plug our flagship event taking place 24th and
Absolutely.
25th of March at the NHC in Birmingham. So we're looking forward to still
Yes,
time
I'll
to
be there.
register as well. Yeah, absolutely. Look forward to seeing you there, Marcus. And you can still register to attend if you haven't done so already. We've got lots of big program out now on the website to look at and lots of different stages and speakers. So should be another good one. But yeah, Marcus, thank you very much for joining me, for speaking so
My
well.
pleasure.
Thanks everyone for being with us. We'll be back soon with another episode. Take care.